Thanks for joining me on Unsolicited Book Reviews with Michael David MacBride. That's me. And today, very special guest, my good friend, Chris Field. We went to graduate school together, got our doctorates. He spent a little more time at Southern Illinois University than I did. But we've remained in touch. He now teaches at Tennessee State University, where, in fact, he has actually taught and is actively teaching book one of what we're going to talk about. We're actually going to talk about book two today. That's the one Chris chose for us to review. But welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining me.
I mean, it'll kind of carry back over into book one too. I mean, because is there really any good way to talk about a book two without also talking about book one a little bit too?
I agree. Yeah, I mean, there's no way to talk about the character. I mean, I guess you could. I don't know. I don't know that this would stand alone on its own. I wonder that about, a lot of time continuations are built so that they're insular, so you could just read book two if you wanted to. I don't think this one works that way. I mean, definitely you need the whole story to kind of make sense of it. But
Oh,
um,
absolutely. I think you're right. And I think that's probably a good place to start is could this stand alone on its own? I don't think so because you get so much of that exposition and setup in book 1 and honestly, like book 2 just kind of plunges you right into the middle of things without giving you like the recap. We're all we're all knowledgeable about episodic television now and how you occasionally get that recap of what happened in the episode before. I suppose that's starting to vanish now because of streaming services like Netflix, where you've only got 15 seconds to decide if you're going to watch the next episode. Never mind, you're already watching the next episode, so you don't need to give that kind of recap. But maybe if it would have had a little bit more recap, it could have acted as a standalone, but I don't think so.
yeah, I would agree. And in fact, like reading it, I had to then go back and reread and brush up on book one because I was like, wait a second, where did we leave off? And I knew there was a cliffhanger, but there was enough gap between one and two coming out and I wasn't teaching it, so like it wasn't fresh in my mind. That I definitely had to go back and look at that again. And I in part like I guess financially, I'm expecting that there'll be an omnibus version of it that will be all collected as one continuous thing at some point. Just because publishing has to make money at some point. So, but I'm curious though. Let's go back to book one. Where did you hear about it first? Do you remember like how you became aware that it was even a thing?
I mean, so my recollection of it was, hearing it winning all of these awards or being nominated for all of these awards. And I usually like to keep a pretty good eye on what, like, some of the more indie publishers, like, Fantagraphics, are publishing. Now, obviously, like you can't keep up on everything, but if you get like a major writer like Dan Klaus and his newest work Monica, I'm trying to stay up with some of those major things. And so when it was originally published, I had heard all of the buzz that it was getting, also saw it's by Fantagraphics, and it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm gonna keep that in mind for some time in the future when I either have copious amounts of free time to be able to read it, or when I have the opportunity to teach it, and it seems like it makes sense. How about you? When did you first remember hearing about it?
I'm notoriously bad at remembering this, but weirdly, this one stands out because, like you, I mean, I follow, I'm on like the newsletters and things from Fantagraphics, and mainly because that was something that you had tipped me off to when we were in school, and then also when we had gone to Comic-Con and like visiting their booth and just loving the work they put out in general. So I saw it come through on there at one point, and the artwork, I mean, it's very interesting. Like I had never really seen anybody render essentially ballpoint pen like that. And so it stood out for that reason. And then I kept seeing it crop up on lists, like the New York Times book list, and, here are books that are coming that are noteworthy and all of those kind of things. And then it so happened that in um, September, I think, September 2017, Emil Ferris, was visiting Minnesota and she had an event. And so I thought, oh, well, this will be fun. And I can't remember, I don't think it wasn't comic book day, but it had been close to one of that weekend. And I had taken the boys and we had gone to comic book day or free comic book day, and we got stuff and shopped. And so they were familiar with the comic book stores and they're super excited. And so when this came up, I was like, well, here we go again. We're going to go back to the comic book store. And this was at something called Comic Book College. And I think they've moved now, but they're in Minneapolis. And so we showed up and it was weirdly desolate. Like nobody showed, I mean, I shouldn't say nobody showed up. The people that were there were having wonderful conversations with her, but there were like three families. And so I just sat there and I chatted with her for a bit. She was very kind. She talked to Dylan and Parker and like was showing them art and, doing little sketches, and it was awesome. And I was like, oh my God, I'm totally hooked. Like she is awesome. Like I'll read whatever she writes. So, then obviously I had to wait a while for book 2 to come out, but, but that was
Yeah.
my weird little entry.
Follow-up question on that. Had you let the boys read any of My Favorite Thing is Monsters book 1 before you guys went to that?
I had not. I had read it, but I had
Okay.
not let them read it. Although we have a pretty liberal policy in our house. So in terms of reading, they have read 1 and 2. Obviously now actually, I guess Parker hasn't read 2, but Dylan read 2 shortly after it came out, probably before I did. So, but they're 15 and 13 now, as opposed to what they would have been in 2017. But yeah, it was an interesting opportunity to connect with her, because then shortly after that, then like all of the prizes started happening, and I don't know that you would have had that kind of access to Emil, and she lives in Chicago, so for me, like her connection to Chicago and like the art museum, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but some of my very favorite moments in the book are just her renderings of art that hangs on the wall in the museum. But anyway.
Yeah, and like, okay, it's not just that. Those are gorgeous. Like seeing those reproductions are absolutely gorgeous. But even in the subtle nods to, artwork. Like for instance, I remember in book 1, um, there there's this uh there's this illustration of Sam Silverberg, and he's like contorted like the famous guitar player from Picasso. And with him as a jazz musician and everything, it makes sense. And it's not even something that she stops and deliberately points out this is an influence. It's a blink and you miss it type of reference, but those subtle nods to kind of, classical paintings are also a beautiful touch.
Yeah, I agree. And it's definitely one of my favorite things about graphic novels is just that those things can exist just on the page, and you can either enjoy them, get the reference or not, or they could even be in the background and, a casual reader might pass right by them. But it rewards, just repeated readings and, say that you start picking up some of those things. But since you did teach book 1, I'm curious, how do you choose a book for a class? Like I know that you had mentioned, well, the theme was around murder, and obviously there's a murder that occurs in this, perhaps a couple off screen as well. But what made you pick this book as something that you wanted to teach?
Okay, so that's actually kind of a complex answer. So in this case, I wanted to keep it affordable. Okay. One of the things that I'm conscious of is that students, and you mentioned the class that I was teaching, it was an upper division class for English majors. And I wanted to pursue the theme of murder, specifically looking at our current obsession, craze, however you want to phrase it, for true crime and specifically murder. So I wanted to look at a work that I knew focused on a murder. Obviously, a lot of those stories are detective types of stories. And I wanted something that was going to be one thick central text. I knew that I could bring in a lot of short stories that I could provide PDFs for so that students wouldn't have to buy books out of pocket. That we could still cover a lot of the same ground while keeping the cost relatively cheap. But I wanted one big, thick central text that we could use and still keep it cheap. So that's what got me started looking at this because it is a big, thick, robust text and the cost if you buy it new with no discounts or anything like that added in, it's $40. So it's still significantly less than if you had to buy 6 or 7 or 8 novels brand new, but at the same time it gives us a lot of material to talk about. So that's how I settled on this one. Is we've got that detective story that's taking us through the process of solving this crime or assimilating our clues. Now at the time book 2 wasn't out yet, so I could kind of look at this as a mystery in progress. Where is this mystery going to go?
Hmm.
who are our main who are our main suspects and who do we think is going to end up committing this murder?
I like it. Yeah, I mean, planning classes is difficult that way, and you're right. I mean, budget's always a concern. The hope I think with maybe a book like something like this is that they might actually like it and be like, oh, this is a book I'll hold on to, as opposed to, as a student, I think I sold back every possible book I could and only held on to very few. So, um, but yeah, I mean the publication. Did you ever talk about the publication story behind the book? Because it's a bizarre story about part one and part two, and anyway.
No, I didn't bring that up too much in class because it was a 7 week class, and so I had like 1 week to devote to this. So we really focused mostly on the work itself without any of the context or background. But you're right, that background, that context is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean she ends up with West Nile virus, and there's like I don't know. Like there's so many weird twists and turns to it. And then I'm not even really fully sure what happens with book two, although I think there were some legal arguments and whatever, and it did not go well. So like that gap. And then there was like a import embargo that like prevented part of it from coming. It's
Yeah.
bizarre. So it's kind of its own little mystery there as well. But I love that idea of a mystery in progress. I was thinking, like when I was watching like Game of Thrones, and I knew that George R. R. Martin hadn't finished writing the books, it was kind of like watching it develop real time. Like, okay, they had his notes and his skeleton outline of who's going to make it or whatever kind of thing, and obviously the writers kind of did whatever they wanted with it, but um
Yeah.
but it was
Especially
interesting.
that last season, huh?
But it was interesting to watch that unfold in a way where you had known the source material beforehand, and then you didn't know where it was going to go, what was going to come out of it. Did you get people complaining that you didn't have a resolution to the murder at the end of one?
No, I don't think so. Because here's the thing: even if we had two, um, do we get a resolution to the murder at the end of two? I mean, I think that the class was a little bit more um, amenable to going on that kind of exploratory journey because they knew that there was a part two that may come out to help provide more answers. If I would have done this and just said, okay, this is a complete work in itself, there is no part two. By the end of this, you have all of the clues. You have to assemble who it is that does this murder. then I think there would have been a little bit more complaining and griping, because I don't think by the end of part one there is a clear cut answer. Now, by the end of part two, we can have a debate on whether or not there's a clear cut answer for this and where I think it may be going. But if I had presented this part one as only a standalone, I think there would have been a little bit more complaining.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm trying to think back to reading book one and wondering if it would stand alone as a complete finished work with, ambiguous ending, which, is not uncommon in literature to leave people guessing and trying to make their own connections. And I agree. I mean, alluding to the ending of book two, it kind of pushes you in that direction anyway. So I don't know, anything, what are some of the things that stand out in book one that you feel like we should talk about before we actually talk about book two?
I think the biggest thing that comes from book one is how it works in order to provide a great introduction to these characters. Like, kind of going back and preparing a little bit for this conversation, I was really struck by the way that it introduces all of these characters in these kind of interesting ways. Like, for instance, for Karen, when we start out, like the first 10 pages or so are this beautiful in media res story where she's just kind of plunged into the middle of this monster movie. As readers, we're taken to the middle of this monster movie that follows a a familiar pattern where we're pursuing the monster. The townspeople are trying to find the monster, and bad things are going to happen to the monster. And that kind of sets up this whole approach to having Karen portrayed as a monster throughout the two books that we now have. Without that kind of backstory, without that in media res to provide that context for it, I don't know if we invest in that approach to portraying her as monstrous. Then we get other characters like Dees when he's first introduced. She really does a great job of breaking down some of the central things about Dees's character. Like, for instance, the tattoos. He's portrayed without his shirt on. She shows the fingers with the ink on them and everything. She just does a really good job of detailing a lot of these kind of subtle character nods to pay attention to as you're focusing for the rest of the graphic novel. What about you? Anything that stands out from book one that you think we probably need to explore?
But I think you're right. I mean, the character introductions and the way that she builds those characters in book one are essential to book two. I mean, I think it's really why, to go back to our earlier thing, I don't know that book two stands alone, because you don't have that investment in character. You would probably be at a loss. I mean, there are a couple mentions like, this is why I visualize myself as a monster. But it's not as engrossing or, as even realistic as the first, in book one is. You really get a sense of who they are and kind of why, and like it makes sense, like you said. I mean, I think, we often talk about like things like the city as character, and Chicago definitely plays such a huge role in both books. And I mean, that's definitely in book two. I mean, there are things woven in there, but I feel like you get a better sense of navigating the streets and the landmarks in book one, and then in book two, and you get a sense of like kind of where the apartments are and the path she takes to the museum. And in some ways it almost reminds me of like Charles Dickens and his navigating the streets of London. It's like, I don't know, I can feel it. It seems very realistic and obviously very familiar there as well. um I mean, you get clues and bits of Anka's story that aren't in book two as well, so you need some of those pieces, and then also that connection of, like, why do they care so much about their neighbors, and I mean, being a neighbor's one thing, but really being invested in who they are and whether they're safe or not, and that kind of stuff is important too. Um, Trying to think. I don't know. Maybe that's about it. I mean, the main characters you mentioned, Dees or Diego, Karen, Anka, the mother. And I'm blanking on her name right now. I should remember it. Oops.
Mama.
Yeah, Mama, Mother. There's Franklin. He's one of my
Mhm.
favorites. I think he's kind of a fun one, and he seems a factor more in book two, which I enjoyed. Um, Mr. Silverberg, Sam, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, actually, and
yeah,
one of the things that I think book one does really well that kind of grabbed my interest is I've always been interested in like historical graphic novels about the Holocaust. I mean, obviously, we owe a large debt in this conversation to Art Spiegelman's Mouse. And, so to see a different side of that portrayal, because in Mouse, we see Spiegelman following his father's
sure.
journey through the Holocaust. Now, obviously, his mother is a part of that, but he doesn't have her voice that he can bring in because his mother committed suicide years before. And in many ways, that's why he is trying to tell his father's story, is to try and figure out what may have caused his mother to commit suicide. Now, with this story, we obviously get a female counterpart to that male dominated story. So to see Anka like go through all of these horrific things that she has to go through leading up to the Holocaust, and then within the Holocaust. I think we get a lot more vivid description in book one than we get in book two. Like the things that we get with, the pharmacy in book one are just horrific. Like
Yeah.
Ferris does such a great job of portraying these young girls and how, they have that kind of blue hue to them that Anka has when she's older and when, obviously she's suffering from depression. You get those same types of portrayals in these younger girls that really stick with you. It reminds me of a lot of the more touching or the more shocking parts of Mouse that stay with you. Uh, Even though you may not have to go back and reread it, it still sticks with you for years.
Yeah, I love that. And it's part of why I love chatting with you about things is you're much more astute and you pay greater attention to things. I always kind of felt like um I was a bit of a poser or hack in terms of comics. Where like I enjoyed them, but like it was never as much a part of my life or my studies as yours. And yeah, I mean, hearing you describe the hues of the young girls. You're right. I mean, I hadn't really thought about that, but it's interesting the palette that she uses. And on one level, it's okay, they're Bic pens, but like on another, it is literally like thinking about how we associate color with the different illnesses or conditions or mental illness or depression or any of those things just run right through those books. Um, yeah.
Well, and that's part of the reason that I love comics and graphic novels is because, you don't need special training to be able to pick up on a lot of this stuff. Like you and I do a fine job of picking up on this without, specifically devoting our entire lives to comics and graphic novels. Although I have devoted a big part of my life to comics and graphic novels. So I think that that's part of what makes it a really nice text to bring into a literature class like the one that I was teaching on murder, is because a lot of the things that you can pick up are kind of intuitive. They're things that, being able to see the imagery as opposed to just, having the written description of it allows students to see how much better trained they are than they think they are. Like, you can use it as a starting point, as a gateway drug into literature that doesn't involve illustrations, because once they start to build their confidence a little bit in, how they can interpret metaphors and how they can interpret symbols, then they start to realize, "Hey, I've got some of this training that's just kind of absorbed through osmosis in there. I really do know a little bit better what I'm doing."
Yeah, no, you're right. And and that was one of the things, and I'm sure you do as well, even with you know, quote unquote high literature or whatever, is to demystify it some, to ask some very basic questions because, you know, I mentioned Dickens earlier. I mean, his stuff was read by the masses, like, he's been canonized now, but like, he should be approachable. He should be doing things in a way that anybody who's reading is interested. And you're right. I mean, then the graphic novel or comics in general, does that one step further by making, I don't know, it's like a space between television or film and books. And in that, you're right. I mean, you're visually, you can pick up on some of those things and you can see these things, whether you're classically trained or not, or, whether you've read quote unquote great literature or whatever. One of
Well,
my, one
and
class
I'm
I
sorry
taught
to
that, that's okay.
sorry to jump in there, but I do want to throw this out there before I lose it, because I'm gonna. Um, you bring up Dickens, and to demystify things like Dickens, because students a lot of times are so intimidated when they see a big thick book like, Great Expectations or something like that, and or Oliver Twist, and they look at it and they say, "Oh no, I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it." And I think that part of our job is to, and not just as teachers, but also in venues like this, in a podcast where, we're talking about literature, is to break it down and make it easier to understand and less intimidating. And so I would love to see someone who was able to take something like Dickens that was originally published in serial form and break it down as readers would have seen it when it was originally published. I'm not aware if someone has done that, but to break it down into smaller, easier to digest components, that way readers didn't feel so intimidated by this big, thick volume that's staring them right in the face. You know what I mean?
I'd love that. I mean, actually, so my very, I don't know if I told you this or not, but my very last class that I took was with one of my favorite professors, William Dyer, and he was retiring, and he said, "One more time before I go, I'm going to teach Dickens and Dostoevsky." And I was like, "Oh, never thought to put those two together. Awesome. I'm signing up." And so I took his class. I don't know if I audited it or whatever, but and it was amazing. And what I was really struck by in there was the serial nature of his books, because Great Expectations had been forced down my throat in high school, and I literally never read any Dickens after that again until this class, when then we read like all of Dickens. I mean, not all. We read 7 of his novels, and then I was like, wow, this guy's really interesting. And the idea that they were published serially and some bi-weekly,
Yeah.
but often on a monthly cadence, and then they couldn't always afford to buy, everybody couldn't buy their own copies, so they would get together communally and read this thing aloud and share the text around the neighborhood, and then they would have 2 weeks or a month to discuss what they think is going to happen. It is an amazing kind of stroke of genius. And I mean, comics, I don't think it's accidental that those Dickens ones were 32 pages. And how long is your standard comic book? It
Yeah.
is between like 25 and 32 pages. I mean, it was like, there's something about that length and giving people enough information to kind of build that anticipation and excitement. It would be really interesting to go back and teach it in that manner. I don't know that students would have the uh, interest in rereading something repeatedly enough to, like, over the course of the week, okay, read it once. All right, read it the second time. Okay, read it a third time.
You know what though? Maybe that's just a call for us to do another podcast. Like maybe a podcast in a serial nature. Maybe using the name serial. Wait a minute. I think somebody already got to that. But yeah, I mean, just any way to demystify literature so that it's not this intimidating Hulk, pardon the comics pun, that you have to beat. Like it I think literature should go back to more humble background that it had, where it was the entertainment for the masses, and we need to do a better job of expressing that this art form should be more open to a lot of other people that don't particularly think of themselves as avid readers.
Well, and I think, yeah, and I mean, this is my own, I guess, personal mission, but when I was teaching, one of my goals was to just do that. And often the easiest path to breaking something down that is deemed serious is like show a comical
Yeah,
example. And Dickens, is a great example. And I didn't discover this because I didn't bother reading Oliver Twist until that class I referenced, which was in 2017 and 2018. But one of the characters in there is his name is Master Bates. And he walks around with white handkerchiefs that he's always fidgeting with. Now, there is no way that is unintentional. And Charles Dickens, if you search through there, like he's the only one that is routinely referred to by master and then last name. And it's hilarious. So, like, he had to have seen the sense of humor in that. And I did go back and I did look, and masturbate was a word a long time ago. So, like, it backs it up. So there's that instance of like, here's this quote unquote serious, great literature guy, but there's humor built in there, and I think his readers would have known that. And when you have the opportunity to read it out loud on the page, you might not think anything of it, but the minute you say those words out loud, you're like, oh my God, I'm kind of
yeah.
embarrassed saying this out loud. So I mean, there's something to that. It would be interesting to go back and kind of break down some of those things. That'd be fun. So book two, Hard
Mhm.
Shift. 7 years later, we have Karen on the cover. Um, I don't know, like we already kind of talked. I had to go back and reread book one because I didn't really remember, and there was no kind Netflix recap at the beginning of it, like you said. I mean, there is kind of, like in here, it kind
Mhm.
of breaks down some of it.
Yeah, sure.
But it wasn't quite enough for me. And I needed to go back and kind of refresh my memory on that. But fortunately, it reads fairly quick. I mean, you point out it's a thick book, but I found it engaging and a pretty fast read. I'm curious. I guess this goes back to book one, but did your students, how did they feel reading it? Like, did it feel like the arduous task of getting a 500-page novel, or they find it more accessible?
Yeah, of course they did find it a little bit more accessible for book 1. I'm not sure if that would carry over to book 2. Because, having not taught book 2 yet, I can only give my own opinion. And I got to be honest, like it's a bit of a slog for book 2. And I could imagine that they would kind of feel the same way, no matter how much time I gave them to read it. I don't know about you, but one of the major issues that I have, and I kind of have to give like just a little bit of a disclaimer here. When I critical of a work, I always try to focus on the work itself rather than focusing on what the work didn't do. What I mean by that is if I start focusing on what the work didn't do, then I get too far into fan fiction. I start, writing my own work. Okay. So one of the things that I kind of focused on initially in book 2 was how busy it was at the beginning. Like you are talking about, I don't know, I didn't count, but you're talking about, I don't, maybe like 100 pages at the beginning where it's just packed into like one morning. like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And it's all on the street, just trying to get to the diner and then to the museum. It's just there are so many things that are introduced there at a breakneck pace, and it doesn't allow you to kind of catch your breath. And I really had a problem with the pacing there at the beginning. It made it difficult for me to get into it because it's like, okay, this, then this, then this, then this, then this, then this, then this. Okay, what's going to be important? Like, which of these things is going to be a thread that we're going to need to come back to later on? It just seemed like it was overwhelming. I don't know how you felt about it.
I struggled, like you said, and it really was probably the first 100 pages. You know, a lot of times, I I don't know. I often, you know, I mean, I pick things up and I read them and then I put them down sometimes, but I didn't feel like I could do that with this because I lost whatever, like I didn't have enough to kind of sink my teeth into, you know, like
Yeah.
it wasn't like, okay, this is where the story's going. I feel
Mhm.
like I can pick this up in a couple minutes or whatever. It was like, I need to commit to reading this in a stretch to see, like you said, kind of like what are the elements I may need to hold on to. And it was jarring because I didn't get that sense in book one. Book one, it felt like you had these quiet moments where you got to know people, or and sometimes stories were like a little issue, you know, like here's a little inset story, and it was self-contained. Where this one just felt like it was kind of rapid fire, and I did. I felt a little lost. It After that, it starts to click a little bit more for me. But that introduction was a rough trial by fire.
Well, and I'm looking for it right now, but uh it was also one of the first times, if memory served me, that we get one of these to be continued types of threads. I didn't count how many times Ferris used this, but it seemed like she was constantly cutting things off. But I'll tell more about that later. Like it works as kind of a clunky plot device where, okay, I'm not going to go into it now. I'll tell more about that later. It's like, okay, when? You can only do that so many times before the reader starts getting distracted by the failure to pay it off. Like, okay, when? When are we going to get this? And for me, in many ways, that kind of left me at the end of this questioning whether this is an ending or whether this story has to continue. I'm not sure if this is an ending or not. Like, obviously, you know, we've talked a little bit about the context here and the legal battle with Fantagraphics, and my understanding of it is that this is the last volume that's going to be published through Fantagraphics, and I'm not sure if there's going to be a volume three of this. I know there's already works that it's already in the works that there's going to be a prequel, but I would think you have to do a volume three of this at a different publisher because for me, so much is unresolved. Some of it is that I'll talk about that later stuff. Some of it is just the bare basic components of the mystery that are never of the couple of mysteries that are never solved.
Yeah, I similarly struggled with that. And like you, I try not to, you know, write the book that I would have wanted to read because I don't feel like that's useful. I mean, that's not the book she wanted to tell. This is the story she wanted to tell. So within that, the struggles that I have are those to be continues. I feel like they were an attempt with I don't know, like any good thriller mystery writer, you know, say what you will about Dan Brown, but you know, the little cliffhanger shift perspective, tell a different story, come back again, you know, builds that kind of momentum and pace and whatever. And here you have one protagonist, so it's a lot harder to cut it off and then start again with a different perspective because you just really have Karen's perspective for the most part. There are some stories where that deviates, but and then the other part that I kept trying to remind myself is that this is supposed to be the notebook of a young girl.
Mhm.
And I, as a not a young girl, but as a young boy, I kept a journal or diary or whatever at different times, and I did stupid things in there. Like I made a list of things to do once, one of which was try on sweatpants, and I don't know
Mm.
why that was important for me to remember to do, but it was dumb. Or I would end a thing sometimes saying like, "See you tomorrow," which is like I mean, I guess I'm going to pick up the journal, but then like days would go by and I wouldn't have written in it. So I don't really know what the motivation there is. So like, is this an attempt to be a very realistic journal kept by a young protagonist? And if so, then it seems like she's done a good job of that. Whether or not that's satisfying to read, I guess is a different question. But I don't know, did you have those thoughts at all about who's writing this and that kind of thing?
Yeah, okay, so that brings me to kind of another small little quibble or gripe. So you have, and that's a great point about, maybe these kind of truncated stories that we have to come back to is just kind of, a mark of immaturity. But we constantly have this shifting of immaturity to way too mature. Like, for instance, some of the high minded conversations regarding art that Karen has with Shelley, it's like, this is not a 10-year-old. Like, obviously, this is, a much older adult, Emil Ferris, who is, kind of striking out on this commentary a little bit. But it just it's so jarring to see those kind of immature moments juxtaposed with maturity. Now, obviously, that could be, a commentary on childhood and how, we're constantly battling against the immature and the mature. But I don't think that it was intentionally focused in this book like that as a conversation that we want to set up about the maturity versus immaturity of Karen. Because, none of those scenes where we're having these high minded art conversations are undercut by the fact that Karen's a child. Like, if you want to have that conversation where, you have immaturity intruding on these very mature conversations, then you would seem to have to cut those off with a reminder, but this is just a child having this kind of highbrow conversation. So for me, it's just kind of jarring
Sure.
to see that immaturity and maturity paired right there without like these moments to kind of I guess signpost that we are questioning our maturity and how we may be maturing a little bit too fast in the wake of a mother's death, father's abandonment, questioning of sexuality, mixed race, like all of these very tumultuous things that are occurring in Karen's childhood that could have prompted her to get to that more mature position faster. We don't get those moments where it just kind of intrudes. Oh, but as mature as we are forced to be, we also have this immaturity that's there too.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. And it's hard to know. I mean, we could I suppose we could ask her. I mean, this is for me, this is like one of the incredible novelties of living authors. I spent so much time studying dead people, and you had to like look into their letters and journals and hope for some little nugget of like, oh, I wrote this thing in chapter 31 that I hope somebody gets the joke about or whatever, like they're never there. There's never any happy resolution, but like we could reach out and ask her, I suppose. But um it's it is interesting to have those moments because you're right. I mean, I, I could see the argument where it's like, yeah, you're really struggling with puberty and like trying you have these moments of flashes. And I've seen this with my own kids where like they're weirdly mature about some things and then such a child in regards to others. But um it didn't feel as consistent especially in book two. Like book one, I felt like it had a very consistent tone, perspective, and something happened. And I don't know, I mean, and honestly, I don't know what the truth is now of the different accounts of the book two. In one version, I had heard there was a hard drive that was lost, that a computer died. I don't know how much of it had to be recreated. I mean, it's hard to know all of the things that intruded in the process of this. But at the end of the day, you said, here's the book, and that's what we're left with. And it is that inconsistency, I think, is one of the things that was frustrating with book two, because I really liked the perspective of one. I'm fine with, a mature young person. And why wouldn't she be forced to mature early when she has seen the trauma that she has, like you said, and the murder in her building, which I guess we need Steve Martin and Marty Short on, and like her brother and his mob ties potentially, not even potentially, expelled out, his hand perhaps in a murder or two. And, like all of these things could easily justify why she is so precocious and mature for her age. And yet it feels like it kind of backslides in book two some.
Well, and like, okay, that's another thread that was introduced in book two that you don't really get in book one. It's like all of a sudden Dees is working for Smiling Jack, and I had to go back and I'm like, did I miss that? Like,
There are
it,
allusions to him doing bad things, but I don't think it was spelled out. Yeah.
no, it wasn't spelled out that he was working for him or anything like that and doing mob stuff. Like, all of a sudden, Dees is an enforcer that is being sent to rough up, I would assume, gambling addicts who can't pay their debts. It's like, all right, we took kind of a hard turn there, but okay, all right, short period of time. All right, fine. That's where the story is now. Uh, I'll go with you. I just felt like book two, in many ways, was you and I both have an interest in music. And we both know that, there have been some contentious relationships between bands or artists and their record companies in the past. And it seems like this book, in many ways, was a contract obligation. Like they're fulfilling the contract so that we can get to a new record company to make the next album that we really want to make. And I think that this was kind of stuck in a similar contract position where Fantagraphics says, no, 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 we contracted for 2 books. And Ferris is like, no, like this should be somewhere else. I should be free to take this somewhere else. And so we get this book that introduces a lot of those threads that haven't been satisfactorily tied up at the end of this book.
Yeah, I kind of wonder, like, if you can play the what if game forever, but the if she had the luxury of telling of the time to tell her story, and she did it more in a serial manner,
Yeah.
if it would have um played, I don't know enough about the industry to know like how likely it is to publish a 400-page graphic novel. It seems like you could do installments of it, and then there would be more regular publication along the way. And I don't know, like it'd be interesting to talk to some of the comic artists out there, and or comic creators, I should say, and what are the pros and cons of those? On one, you're on a deadline and you have to turn it around at a certain point and you have to say, I'm done.
Yeah.
And, that is a distinct possibility. She ran into a number of problems along the way, and then she had to be done at some point. And sometimes done feels better than perfect. And I don't know. What are things? I'm sorry, go ahead. You finish.
Oh, go ahead. No, no, no. I'm
I,
on your dime.
So we've talked about the things that we struggle with in book two. Are there things that you like in book two? Like, what are some of the things that stood out to you as positive or additive to book one that you enjoyed?
Oh, of course. I mean, look, please do not take this slight little criticism as saying that the entire thing is bad. It's not. Like, it's still heads and shoulders above a lot of the other works that are produced in this medium. So no, no, I don't think it's by any stretch of the imagination bad. Like, of course, I'm just being fussy here. Um, but some things that that she does really well are, of course, she is, you know, sensitive to this historical time period and the shifts that are occurring in late 60s, early 70s. She does a great job of, you know, capturing this time period, capturing these emerging groups of people that, you know, are just excuse me, that are just starting to gain like widestream or mainstream acknowledgement during this time. Like, for instance, the shift in personality from, or the shift in identity, I should say, not personality, the shift in identity from Franklin to Francois, I think is done really beautifully. Like, we don't spend a lot of time on it. It's not kind of torturously drawn out. It's just kind of introduced in the way that it's introduced to Karen. We get to see it through her eyes. I'm Francois. This is who I am. Can you refer to me as Francois from now on? And I think that that Ferris does a good job of portraying Karen as the typical person in society from the late 60s up to the present, where, yeah, there's been a lot of political conversation about how to approach these kind of shifting identities in our society. And there are some people who we know are resistant to that kind of change. But I like to think anyway, that the majority of us say, okay, I'm going to have to learn more about this. I'm going to have, you know, some mistakes. Karen says, I'm going to have mistakes where, you know, I may call you Franklin, and I apologize for that in advance, but I'm going to do my best to try to adapt to this. And I think that Ferris does a beautiful job of kind of showing, you know, a supportive system around Francois that allows this new identity to flourish, or this I wouldn't say new identity, but this emerging identity to flourish. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I agree. I love a lot of the neighborhood and community aspects in book two, where you really get a sense of some of the characters there. I love, like you said, the really the depictions of the different immigrants and finding their way here. I love, and I didn't mention this earlier, but I love the horror
Yeah.
covers. Like those recreations are just glorious and kind of awesome. And you know, if I had my chance to ask Ferris about this project, like it would be like, what came first? You know, I could imagine drawing those posters in my notebook, like copying those and then, you know, doing the art. I mean, because I was a struggling art student when I first started undergrad, and we had to go to the museum and we had to copy people, you know, and so we did that. Um, but it is interesting, like the love of the horror genre throughout this, when it is also a Holocaust story and is also a story about, you know, becoming an American and what that means. And I mean, there's so many things going on in here. And I'll say, you know, for whatever we said about book two, I think given what it is, I like the ending ultimately, you know, like without my revisionist of what I would have done differently or whatever, I think the ending is satisfying, at least to me, I think. I don't know. I'm curious where you come down on the ending of book two.
Well, okay, first off, before we go back to, you know, criticizing, let me get one more thing out that I just love about this. And it stays consistent from book one to book two. And that is using like one central painting as kind of your touchstone that you keep going back to. Okay, in book one, it's obvious. Actually, in book one, she uses multiple different paintings that she goes back
Yeah.
to. There's the painting of the Magdalena with the skull sitting in her lap, and we go back to that several times. There's also the painting of that she says represents the three sides of Deeze's personality, with the dragon, the knight, and the princess. So she does a great job in book one of kind of setting up that general motif of being directed by fine art, being directed by these paintings. I feel like we don't do it as much in book two, but it's still there with the Judith paintings, and how that directs Karen to try to make these sacrifices for her village, for her people, for Dees and Francois, and for Shelley and the people that she cares about. So I love that. I think that if this is to continue on, that we keep seeing that. I would like to keep seeing that. Now, as
Wait,
far
let
as
me
the
let me
ending
add
goes,
one other thing really
sure,
quick
sure.
about things I enjoyed in book two, and I'm curious if you picked up if you noticed this too. But
Mhm.
to me, it felt like in book two, some of Ferris's art was like there was more diversity in styles. Like at one point, there are almost like line drawings, and I was trying to find it in here, like very simplistic kind of line drawing moments that were interesting, and then the super rendered ones, and then sometimes hyper realistic and other times a little more cartoony, and it was interesting just to see the different approaches. And again, I guess thinking like this is a young protagonist and this is your notebook, like you would be experimenting with some of those different styles as well.
Sure.
um I don't know, did you notice any that you particularly enjoyed, or um make any stories up about why that happened?
Oh, sure. Like one of the things for me is if you go back to book one, one that I remember is when Anka is lying in bed with the girl who is teaching her about how to please men and about how to please herself. And she starts touching her and brings her to orgasm. Those illustrations are far less photorealistic, more like sketch drawings than you would get, in other parts of the book. And I think that, drawing those types of images allows Ferris to show. I think you're right that it's, a young protagonist who is, trying to work out her own style, but also how, you know, these types of narratives cause these types of shifts in art style throughout. We're not just getting one straight ahead narrative style. We're getting a horror story, we're getting a detective, we're getting buildings Rahman, we're getting these all these different kinds of stories that also have to shift in their artistic portrayal as the narrative shifts to different types of genres. Does that make sense?
I like it. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but you're right. I mean, the narrative kind of drives that, and I, I'll have to go back and look at that and see, because I mean, it makes sense. I mean, some of them, the one example I found in book one, I couldn't find the one you were talking about, but there's a little inset rectangular thing, and it's just like I think it's 8 panels kind of within the rest of the page, and it's just figures colored in, like it's just you can't see anything other than their outlines. So that would totally make sense that that would be its own style to indicate it's separate and distinct, but the narrative shifts also make sense for stylistic changes. All right, what were you going to say about the end?
Well, I was going to ask you, who kills Anka?
So you're right. I mean, I don't think we get a satisfying answer there. For me, I think the ending is left ambiguous because Karen has decided it doesn't matter. I mean, not that it doesn't matter, that's not the right word, but um, that if it's her brother, then she's kind of comes to terms with why or how that happened, and that he holds a lot of guilt and sorrow for that. That he um, and if it was somebody else, then she feels kind of hopeless to find it. Um, but I mean, it seems like Dees is probably the most likely culprit. But what about you?
What happened to Mr. Chug? What happened to Karen?
Sure.
I mean, I think that this has to go on. I think that this is kind of a transitory book to where we eventually get something that's tied up in maybe a third volume.
Hmm.
If you're asking who I think killed Anka, okay, so here's the thing. We're being led to believe it's D's. I mean, obviously, we're being led to believe it's D's. And come on, you and I have studied enough literature to know that it's never the person you're being led, it's never the character you're being led to believe it is. Like the mark of any true good detective fiction is you're always going to have a red herring. It's never the most likely suspect. So I'm going to say it's Smiling Jack Cronin. I think that's who kills because Dees admits that he was there when it happened. Also, he's now had to start working for Jack Cronin. Jack's holding something over his head that, causes him to have to work. If he was there as a witness, also, Mr. Chug writes in his notebook that serves as nothing more than a plot device that he writes in riddles to himself, which doesn't make any sense. He doesn't think anybody else is going to read this notebook, but he writes that it was, someone's family member. And let's take a look at all of the family members that we have. The two most likely suspects would be, of course, Dee's, Karen's family member, and Mr. Silverberg or Sam, Anka's family member. But we also have Smiling Jack, who is, married to his wife. And so covering up an affair with Anka would seem like the most likely outcome there. Also, we know that the passage that leads down into the basement somehow leads over to the club that Smiling Jack owns, the Mobsters Club, and Mr. Chug comes out. He sees the person who has killed Anka or presumably shot Anka, who he doesn't identify in the notebook. Serves as a terrible diary if you're not going to write out your actual thoughts. But anyway, to keep the mystery alive, he doesn't identify the person. We're led to believe it's probably Dee's, but it's probably Smiling Jack who is fleeing to his club underneath through the basement so that no one sees him leave the apartments.
Pretty compelling. I'll go along with that. I like it. I mean, ultimately, I think the reason I like the D's answer is it's so close to home that it really forces Karen to, come to terms with the fact that her brother's not perfect, and which she knows. She knows he's not perfect. So maybe she doesn't need that revelation, but um, yeah. All right.
I think I think that's the other mystery that we still have to solve is exactly why Dees killed their brother Victor. And I don't think that that's been satisfactorily answered yet either. And I think part of what we're going to get there is, of course, the father's story.
Hmm.
Obviously, Karen went to confront the father. That's how she ends up with, the head wound and, the
At the
loss of
end,
memory.
right? Yeah.
And so I think that a volume 3 would have to focus on her recovering her memory. And that helps to uncover, from the father's perspective, some of the things that would have led to Dee's killing their brother. And she's going to confront that he is not perfect, but at the same time, he serves in this protector or guardian role for her. So while he may not be perfect, we're eventually going to find that his rationale is going to be, while maybe not, completely justified, it's going to be something that's probably sound where Karen can forgive him. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and I think I can't remember if you said this earlier or not, but I remember reading that the next book will be a prequel.
Hmm.
So it'd be interesting to see if it's the father's story independent of everything else. Because if you push Karen back too much earlier, I think it would be kind of hard to believe that she'd be writing a journal and a notebook like that. Or maybe it's Anka's story, although we've heard Anka's story enough, but I like the idea of kind of thinking ahead to like what a third volume would be. Because you're right. I mean, the Victor story is not wrapped up. Um, it would be nice to have, I guess, more clues for Anka's murder. Figure out a little bit more about exactly what um, Diego or Deeze's connections are to the mob, and if he's got a path out of that, or
I think the path out is if he finally turns on Smiling Jack and says he was the person that killed her. By the way, keep him locked up. Uh, I just, yeah, I think that the prequel could end up being volume 3 just because that's a really nice way around contracts. Like if Fantagraphics was contracted for a next book and she's like, "Yeah, but it's really a prequel." Sure, we may get some stuff that is in the present or even the future, but most of it's prequel. I think that's a nice way around a contract, and we'll let the lawyers
yeah,
fight out.
sure, for sure. Anything else you want to say about book one or book two?
I'll put it like this. I am looking forward to seeing where it goes. Prequel, sequel, whatever the case may be. I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes. Yeah, there were some difficulties in book 2, but it's not anything that is enough to cause me to like divest myself from this story. I'm still interested in seeing where it goes. I still think that stylistically, aesthetically, Ferris is such a great artist that she's held my attention, and narratively there's enough there to continue for me to invest in this story to see how it's resolved. How about
Yeah,
you?
yeah, same. I mean, artistically, I'm just blown away by it. I mean, it is really beautiful, and I love the different styles in there. I love the work with the ballpoint pen. I mean, I am also indebted to her with the time with my children. Like that, I will probably continue reading whatever she writes regardless. But yeah, I think the stories are really interesting, and um, it'll be fun to see what she does next, and if there is something outside of this story that then she wants to tell also, and what that looks like. You know, it's interesting her being by most standards, an older artist to break into comics. And so in some ways, like this is an early book for her, and she's lived a lot of life, but in terms of story on the page, we don't have much beyond these two books. There was a free comic book one at
Yeah.
one point that I saw. I don't really remember it very well, but I remember picking that up, and so yeah, it'll be fun. But
Well, and I would I would also like to see after Karen is just slightly older than you and I. Like she's relatively the same age, just slightly older than us. And I would like to see her in present day. I would like to see after, all of the shifts that we've had with, especially sexual identity in the past, 30 years or so. I would like to see Karen in present day and whether or not she still thinks of herself as monstrous. Because a lot of her monstrosity is due to these kind of unhealthy ideas that she's gotten about sexuality passed down to her from her mother. And I would like to see an older Karen, and whether or not she's ever been able to get past looking at herself as monstrous, and whether she's been able to, fully accept this identity independent of a kind of the societal pressure to conform and to react in some specific way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do think it would be really interesting, the current day one. I kept thinking like, just to continue the matrilineal storyline, I guess, like that she's a parent then, and like you said, she's kind of the mysterious mother, that her mother kind of spoke in riddles and whatever, and so there's an opportunity there. But it would be interesting to see how she overcomes that and what her life looks like now. Um, yeah, yeah, we'll see. But
Yeah, I think there's a really good way to get to that point. I think when we see Francois, I don't know if you caught this or not, but when we see Francois step out into that personality, that identity, you see the scars more or less disappear. And I think, a lot of that is because of, wearing makeup and stuff like that. But I think also stylistically, a part of that is because, we're becoming more comfortable with this identity. We're becoming more comfortable with this acknowledgement and this I guess, growing into self. And I think that, Karen and viewing herself as a monster or a werewolf will also start to do that, lose the fangs, lose the, kind of hairy facial features and stuff like that as she starts to accept more and more of her identity.
yeah, I mean, literally becoming more comfortable in their skin, I guess, as
Right.
well. So, yeah. Thanks so much for meeting with me and chatting. Um,
Thanks for
anything you
suggesting it.
anything
This
you
has
want to
been fun.
pitch or mention that's up and coming, or
No. I'm kind of boring in that regard. I do the one thing and I try to do it well. I fail most of the time, but just that. No, there's no other projects that I've got coming out or anything to pitch right now. But stay tuned. I'm working on a comic series that, I would like to get out in the world at some point called Influencer. So I would really like to be able to come back at some point and kind of pitch that. But getting the title on recording is a great way to copyright it.
I love it. Well, I can't wait to hear more about influencers.
Thanks for listening. You can find out more about me at my webpage, michaelmacbride.com, or on most social media platforms with the same handle, at Michael MacBride. That's MacBride, like Mac and Bride. Let me know what you're listening to, or if you read one of these books, leave me a comment and let me know what you thought. Have a great day.